So first let's talk about the marquee tools. There's the rectangular, elliptical, and then single row and single column marquee tools. Now you notice these last two don't have the letter M beside them because that's frankly because they're not very commonly used. It's pretty far-fetched to think that you would be using this on a regular basis. Now the other thing is you might think at first, well, why would I want to use the rectangular marquee tool because, like in this photo, I don't have anything to select that's rectangular. Well, the other way to think of the rectangular marquee tool and the elliptical marquee tool for that matter is it's anything you need to have that's rectangular. It doesn't need to necessarily be selecting part of the photo. So for example, let's say we were going to lay this out or we wanted to have some text here. Well, it would be pretty hard to read the text over all this information. So what I might do is add a new layer, take my rectangular marquee tool, and make a rectangular selection that I'll then fill with white. Now I'm going to fill it 100% white, even though I don't want it to end up that way. Deselect it, Command or Control D. Now I have this white box on layer by itself, and now I come over here to my layers panel and lower the opacity. So you can still kind of see what's in behind. Take the move tool, it's still movable, so you can still decide where you want to put it, but now if I added some text over the top, it'd be much easier to read. So that's just a simple example of where we could actually use the rectangular marquee tool, because honestly the number of times you're going to need to make a selection that's of an object that's a perfect rectangle, depending on the work you do, I'm guessing it's probably not going to be all that common. So having a tool that just simply makes almost like a shape, that's a rectangular shape, then that works for us as well. Now, let's go back a step here. Let's pretend for a moment. Let's pretend that I was drawing with my rectangular marquee tool, and then I realize it's not quite in the right place. Well, without letting go of my mouse, if I hold down the space bar, it lets me reposition. Now, if I was doing this on a separate layer, I wouldn't need to do this, but let's say for the sake of argument that I was just going to do it right here on the background, which by the way I wouldn't highly recommend, but just for the sake of argument, holding on the space bar as long as your mouse is active lets you position it. Now you may still end up putting it on a layer by itself. It's just while you're trying to figure out the right size, that's a pretty good little shortcut to use. So at this point, even though I didn't make a layer first, it doesn't really matter. As long as I have my selection, then I can go ahead, make a new layer, and do my fill command or whatever it is I want to do next. Let's fill it with black this time, just for the sake of argument. Deselect it, Command Control D, lower the opacity to get that kind of screened look. Now, the same theory applies, of course, to the elliptical marquee tool. Drag to make an oval. Now, one of the keyboard shortcuts you'll probably won't be surprised to know is if you, with either of these two tools, if you hold down the Shift key, it constrains. So if you want a perfect circle, hold down the Shift key as you drag, and it will make a perfect circle. Then we'll have our selection which we can do something with. Now let me show you an example of one of the ways people use that elliptical marquee tool is to make a special effect. So let's add a curves adjustment layer, and all we're going to do in this curves adjustment is drag this way down till it makes it really dark. Every time you use an adjustment layer, it has a layer mask associated with it. So let's take our elliptical marquee tool, just make a big oval that we'll use that same spacebar trick to kind of position it. Now remember the way a mask works. White is revealing the entire effects of this adjustment layer. So if I don't want the middle part to be darkened, I would fill that with black. So I would simply switch my colors around. I could use the keyboard shortcut since we use the fill command a couple times. Option delete on the Mac or Alt backspace will create this oval mask. Now right now it doesn't look very good because it's solid, or I should say has a very hard edge to it. Well, that's where we can use this masks panel, and we'll look more at this in more detail, but you can see after the fact we can feather the edge and also lower the density of it a little bit if we want to, and that creates this nice kind of vignette spotlight effect. So even though at first glance you might think on a regular day-to-day basis you might not use either one of these tools a whole lot, you can start to see as we start to play with it, these actually do become tools we use on a fairly regular basis. Now, one thing I did want to mention about these tools is that the options bar, we do have these options, normal, fixed ratio, or fixed size. As I said before, normal means click and drag anywhere and it'll create a rectangle or oval, depending on tool you're using, of course, of that size. If you want it to be a specific ratio, for example, 5 by 4, which, whoops, I said 5, but I typed in 6, which was terribly clever of me. Let's try that again. 5 by 4. I'm not putting inches in, I'm just putting a ratio, which means no matter how big I make it, it's creating a ratio which is the same as an 8 by 10 photo, as an example. See how it's constraining? I'm not holding down any keys, it's just constraining based on that fixed aspect ratio. The other possibility is to go for a fixed size. So if you know you're working on a project where you need to select portions of a photo that are 200 pixels by 200 pixels, as an example, now whatever I click, that becomes my selection. Click once, and that becomes the top left-hand corner. Now, one of the other little potential gotchas about these option bar settings is if you leave it that way, and the next time you come back to use the rectangular marquee tool, you'll go to click and drag and wonder why it's doing this, is because it still says fixed size. So, as a general habit, again, check your settings, go back to normal if need be. The other thing is, just so you know, when you're choosing fixed size, it often is going to, well, it will initially at least think of pixels, but you can also tell it if you know you want to be 4 inches by 6 inches, you can type in those numbers and then you'll get a selection which is that fixed size. But again, as a habit, what I typically do if I've used fixed size, I go back and change it to normal before I leave this tool, so the next time I use it, it will be back at just a normal setting without any specific options set to it. So that gives you a good idea of the various ways we can use the two main marquee tools, the rectangular and the elliptical marquee tools.